This video discusses Japanese surrender in a world at war, GMT's World War II grand strategy game. Support this channel by hitting the subscribe button so you don't miss any future videos. This video can be thought of as a companion piece to the video on German surrender. If we are interested in the history of the Japanese surrender rules, we can ignore the original Third Reich and skip over Advanced Third Reich for the moment, because both games only covered the European theater. For the Pacific theater, we go to the Empire of the Rising Sun, often referred to as Rising Sun. The cover picture, incidentally, is from a 1942 Italian postcard. I first saw this as a teenager, and I liked it so much that I managed to get it on a box cover. While we have moved on from Rising Sun, I still think the cover picture is great, and it survives in the Storm over Asia rules. I am nothing if not loyal. The Rising Sun approach to Japanese surrender mirrored the Advanced Third Reich approach to Britain and Russia, which both had resistance tables. For resistance tables to work, they have to have a basic positive modifier, then both positive and negative modifiers, with the negative modifiers being able to drive the overall resistance level to 0 or less. For the Advanced Third Reich British resistance table, this basic positive modifier was provided by Allied units in Britain. For the Russian resistance table, it was provided by the Russian industrial centers. In a world at war, these basic positive modifiers for Britain and Russia have been replaced by their diplomatic point level. Rising Sun included a Japanese resistance table, so this concept has been part of the game for more than 30 years. Am I the only one that finds it funny that the Rising Sun rule politely asks players to please refer to the Japanese resistance table? You won't find that sort of thing in the World at War rules, and a quick search confirms the word please doesn't appear in the World Crisis rules either. Back to business. Here is the 1995 Japanese resistance table. For the necessary basic positive modifier, it adopted the British resistance table approach of +1 for every 5 Japanese ground and army air factors in Japan, Okinawa, Korea, and Manchuria. This didn't work well because it involved a lot of counting and led to Japan being packed with units near the end of the game. The original Japanese resistance table had other features which didn't pass the test of time. Japan incurred a negative modifier for oil effects. Smart Japanese players figured out that when Japan was in danger of surrendering, it should hold an oil party, offsetting all its oil effects in order to prolong the game by a turn. Unbuilt Japanese ground and army air factors were a negative modifier. This meant a lot of counting. The Japanese BRP level was ultimately a negative modifier, which assumed a normal Japanese BRP level. Fast forward to a world at war. The Rising Sun rules were refined by the time a world at war debuted in 2003, but not nearly enough. There were a number of changes from the Rising Sun Japanese resistance table, but the most notable was that the annoying +1 for every 5 factors in Japan was replaced by a +20 basic Japanese resistance level, since they came out to roughly the same value. In 2008, the Japanese resistance table was significantly improved, including by dividing modifiers into situation and cumulative modifiers. In addition, many of the current modifiers were introduced. However, the basic +20 modifier remained. Within a few years, that modifier was replaced by a version of the current modifier for Allied casualties. This was done partly for variety, but mainly because Japanese players had figured out that the best way to play Japan was to avoid fighting, which is not quite what you want in a war game. That brings us to the current rules. The starting point is that Japan still surrenders when its resistance level is 0 or less. The concept is fine, The problem was in implementing it. As a safeguard, Japan also surrenders if the objectives in Japan and Manchuria are occupied by the Allies. As we will see, this can matter. Rule 5713 explains situation modifiers. Then there is a reference to possible Japanese atomic attacks, which didn't seem to fit anywhere else. The boxed comment starts, since this has never happened, but in fact Japan did get the atomic bomb in a game at the 2025 convention, so this comment will be changed. The rules relating to cumulative modifiers are about half a page long, so I won't cover them in detail. The important point is that the application of situation modifiers is determined each turn, while cumulative modifiers, as the name implies, add up. So let's go to the Japanese resistance table. The Japanese resistance table is also about half a page long, so we will break it down. First, we'll look at the situation modifiers, which either apply or don't apply at the end of each turn. Japan's resistance level is increased by 1 for each Pacific Front objective under Japanese control. There are 14 Pacific Front objectives, but by the time Japanese resistance is approaching 0, Japan will control only 1 or 2 of them, if they're lucky. Japan gains 1 resistance point for each of Singapore, Manila, Vladivostok, and Irkutsk. Unlike the Pacific Front objectives, Japan might be able to hold on to some of these until the end of the war. Obviously, the 2 Russian objectives are only in play if Japan has attacked Russia, and done well. Japan gets resistance points for its maximum expansion in the Pacific. Normally, this will be around 7 or 8 resistance points. Japan never loses these resistance points, even though it almost certainly will lose the island groups themselves. At the start of the game, Japan controls 4.5 island groups for a +4 Japanese resistance modifier. When Japan goes to war with the Western Allies, it will quickly get to at least 7 island groups, but how much farther it can get will depend on many factors. If the Allies invade Japan, Japan incurs some serious negative modifiers. Just how many depends on how much of Japan the Allies take. Japan also incurs negative modifiers for Allied control of Chinese, Manchurian, and Korean objectives, as well as Taipei and Okinawa. Normally, Japan will control all of these objectives except Chongqing for a net -1. However, this can change as the Japanese position deteriorates. Finally, Japan can incur negative resistance modifiers for atomic attacks and firestorms, just as Germany can. While all the situation modifiers can matter, most commonly an Allied invasion of Japan or atomic attacks are needed to finish off Japan. Why that is becomes clearer when we look at the cumulative modifiers, which really determine the strength of Japan's resistance. The cumulative modifiers can be grouped according to where Japan expands beyond its basic co-prosperity sphere. If Japan attacks Russia, it gains 1 resistance modifier for each turn it controls the Siberian cities within 3 hexes of Manchuria, and gains an additional resistance modifier for each turn it controls both Vladivostok and Irkutsk. The 4 Siberian cities are doable, with Chita being the toughest target. Taking Irkutsk for a second modifier is a real accomplishment and requires a very successful attack on Russia. If Japan instead goes after India, it gains 1 resistance modifier each turn that it controls 3 of the objectives in that area: Calcutta, Colombo, Dhaka, and Rangoon. Rangoon is easy for Japan to take, but getting to Dhaka, Calcutta, and Colombo is a challenge. This involves a serious invasion of India. Another Japanese option is to invade Australia. Again, Japan needs to get 3 out of the 4 targets to gain a resistance modifier each turn. Port Moresby is the relatively easy one. Cairns, Darwin, and Townsville are harder, both to take and to keep. A fourth Japanese plan is to expand in the Pacific, which is the safest plan for a number of reasons. From the Japanese resistance standpoint, if Japan gains control of 8 island groups to the US 6 island groups, it gains 1 resistance point each turn. If Japan can somehow get a 10-4 advantage in island group control, it gets a 2nd resistance point each turn. These Japanese goals are complicated both by oil requirements and by Pacific raiding, which may neutralize island group control for Japanese resistance purposes. Finally, an important component of Japanese resistance is the casualties they inflict on the Allies. For every 50 BRPs of enemy casualties, Japan gains 1 resistance modifier. These are tracked from the start of the game, beginning in China. Then there are the negative cumulative modifiers, which reduce the Japanese resistance level, offsetting whatever positive cumulative modifiers Japan managed to get, then negating other positive Japanese resistance modifiers. There are 2 sources of negative cumulative modifiers. The first is based on control of the situation modifiers in Asia. These modifiers are explained in Rule 57.14g. The Allies get -1 for control of each objective in China, Manchuria, and Korea. Japan gets +1 for control of each objective in Russia. Then the modifiers are compared. Unless Japan has attacked Russia, it will have no positive modifiers, and China normally would control Chongqing, so the Allies will have a -1 advantage, well short of the -4 advantage they need to trigger a -1 cumulative modifier. Once Germany surrenders, Russia will declare war on Japan. If Russia conquers Manchuria and captures Peking, the Allies will get their -4 advantage, triggering a -1 cumulative modifier. 2 more Chinese objectives would have to be captured to increase this to a -2 cumulative modifier. To trigger the maximum -3 cumulative modifier, the Allies have to completely reconquer China and take Korea as well. However, it isn't always the Russians who do the heavy lifting. In some games, the United States might invade the mainland and liberate China, triggering at least 1 negative cumulative resistance modifier in a different way. The second source of negative modifiers kicks in when the Allies get an edge in island group control. 1 negative Japanese resistance modifier for a 2-island group advantage, and 2 negative Japanese resistance modifiers for a 6-island group advantage. This is a typical situation at the turning point of the game, with each side controlling 7 island groups. Unless the Allies are losing, they will always start triggering the negative island group modifiers at some point. The question is when. Having reviewed the current Japanese resistance table in some detail, we can now see that the necessary basic positive Japanese modifier, which took different forms in earlier versions of the rules, first units in Japan, then simply +20, has 2 sources. The high water mark of Japanese expansion in the Pacific, which starts at 4.5 and will always go to 7, 8, or more, and Allied casualties, which start at 0 and can increase Japanese resistance by up to +2 each turn. The second modifier is especially important because it forces, or at least induces, Japan to fight. If the Japanese player decides not to play a war game, a significant positive component of the Japanese resistance level will be missing, with predictable consequences. As was done in the video on German resistance, we can look at the Japanese resistance level in 1945 in my 2020 convention game. In that game, Japan attacked Russia in 1942 and drove it to the edge of the mapboard, mainly because Russia was in trouble in Europe. Russia came back, though, and by spring 1945, the Japanese resistance level was 14, which happened to be exactly the number of positive resistance modifiers Japan had gained from inflicting casualties on the Allies, with Japan's island group modifier offsetting the negative modifiers the Allies were inflicting. In summer 1945, Japan lost 2 resistance points for island groups and another 1 for losing a Chinese objective, but it gained 1 for Allied casualties, so it was at 12. In fall 1945, the Japanese resistance level dropped by 2, as the Allies weren't in a position to invade Japan, and they used their only atomic bomb on Germany. The Japanese resistance level was 10. In winter 1945, another -2 from island groups took effect. The negative cumulative modifiers for a Japanese collapse on the Asian mainland began to apply. Japan lost Vladivostok and Harbin, and there was another firestorm in Japan. This reduced the Japanese resistance level to 4, but without an atomic attack, Japan was able to keep on fighting. In the following turn, however, Japan would lose another 2 for island groups, at least 1 for the mainland, and would have been firestormed at least once. So even without an atomic attack, which was guaranteed, Japan would have surrendered in spring 1946, so the game was called at this point. This graph shows the trajectory of the Japanese resistance level throughout the game, as well as the Japanese resistance level from a subsequent game up to the end of 1942. For good measure, the final 3 turns of the German resistance level are shown as well. The path of the Japanese resistance level is typical, although in games where Japan runs away with the game, it could go higher and stay high. Japan's resistance level starts around 10, goes up to the low 20s by the end of 1942, and then either levels off or keeps going up, depending on whether Japan is gaining cumulative modifiers in Russia, India, Australia, or the Pacific. At some point, the Japanese resistance level starts going down as the Allies overpower Japan. The rate of decline may vary, just as Japan's high point will be different in each game. Some of Japan's drop comes from losing Pacific objectives, but Japan will lose these in almost every game, so in a sense Japan loses modifiers it knew it wouldn't have when it counted. Who wins the game, and by how much, depends on exactly when Japan surrenders. From the point of view of both sides, the key is to maximize, or minimize, the Japanese accumulation of cumulative modifiers, as these determine Japan's high point, and to delay, or accelerate, the triggering of negative modifiers which bring the Japanese resistance level down from its high point to 0, ending the war in the Pacific. Japan wants to force the Allies to either invade Japan or make atomic attacks on it, while the Allies would like to force a Japanese surrender without resorting to either. The course of the war up to 1945 will determine which side gets their way.